Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. As the leaves change color and fall from the trees and the cold air creeps in, it's not unusual to feel a sense of isolation, making the world feel both empty and overwhelming. The quiet becomes unsettling, and being alone brings out our deepest fears, whether it's an actual empty house or the loneliness of our own thoughts. Only darkness and terror follow. First, silence holds the secrets no one hears, followed by the monster inside you. Finally, in our last story, you are never alone. It follows. Before we get into today's stories, I have something exciting to share with you. Last week, we launched our brand new Something Scary Patreon storyteller experience, and now you can dive deeper into the eerie and mysterious with exclusive perks just for our storyteller fans. By joining this new Patreon tier, you'll unlock access to our monthly film club live stream with me, Blair, where we discuss horror films chosen by you. After each live stream, you'll also get exclusive behind-the-scenes access with a Q&A to answer your burning questions. And we're going to have our first meeting very soon. But that's not all. Storyteller Experience members will also enjoy a 20% discount on Something Scary merch and a chance to collaborate on our next spine-chilling story. Together, we'll create a terrifying tale that just might end up on our podcast. It's one way of saying thank you for being a part of this amazing community and keeping the spooky spirit alive all year round. Don't miss out. Join the Something Scary storyteller experience today for even more chills and insider treats. Head to patreon.com/snarled to sign up now. So, want to hear something scary? The screams of silence. In 1959, 9 Russian hikers mysteriously died in the Ural Mountains. This story of isolation and horror is inspired by those true events, written by Sara. The storm arrived without warning, though it had been brewing for days. An invisible weight in the air that seemed to press down on them, heavier with each passing hour. The wind howled through the Ural Mountains like an animal on the hunt. At first, the hikers had spoken of it only in cautious, half-joking terms, as if acknowledging the storm would somehow make it less real. But soon enough, the mountain had proved its cruel indifference, and there were no pretending anymore. Dmitri, their leader, had always prided himself on his ability to read the weather. He had known, as they had set up camp beneath the darkening sky, that this would be no ordinary storm. The cold that settled over them was different, like a shadow, too deep to escape, suffocating in its silence. They huddled in their tents, speaking little, each person alone with their thoughts, but not truly alone. The storm outside seemed to press in on them from all sides, the wind rattling the fabric of the tents as though it were trying to tear through. Tasha, the youngest of the group, spoke first, a quiet murmur cutting through the muffling snow. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, a shiver in her voice. The others had paused, eyes darting about as though expecting something or someone else in the tent with them. But there was nothing, only the wind, only the deepening silence. "No," Dmitri had answered, the word hanging between them, a wall he could not help but construct. "Nothing to worry about, just the storm." But Tasha had not been convinced. She shifted in her sleeping bag, the faint crinkle of fabric sounding loud in the heavy quiet. "It didn't sound like the storm," she said, voice trembling. "It was like someone walking." No one responded. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the tent grew thick, and when sleep finally came, it was restless, uneasy kind of sleep. Every gust of wind seemed to bring something new, a creak, a crack, a distant, indistinct sound from the trees. But still, none of them spoke of it. And then, in the early hours of the morning, Yuri was gone. At first, Dmitri thought it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in memory, the fog of sleep clouding his senses. But when he unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold morning air, the reality of the situation hit him with terrifying clarity. There was no sign of Yuri, not a trace of his gear. It was as though he had vanished, dissolved into the white landscape, leaving no evidence he had ever existed. "Yuri?" Dmitri called into the storm, his voice cracking on the wind, but there was no answer, just the wild, unrelenting howl of the mountain itself. The others were already awake, their faces pale and drawn, though none of them spoke. It was as if they were all waiting for something, some sort of explanation they knew would never come. "I don't understand," Mikhail whispered, his voice thin with fear. "He was here, just hours ago." The storm was pricking up, the snow swirling around them in a blinding fury, but Dmitri felt the weight of something heavier than the snow itself. He could not explain it, but it had already begun, the oppressive sense of wrongness that clung in the air, sinking in the marrow. They searched for hours, their efforts growing more frantic as the hours passed, but there was no sign of Yuri, only the deepening cold and the endless, suffocating whiteness of the snow. And then, as the last traces of daylight faded and the storm raged on with a fury that threatened to swallow them whole, they found it. It was not far from the camp, just on the edge of a ridge where the snow had settled in a strange, unnatural shape. At first, they thought it might be another body, but then they got closer. The truth became more terrible than they could have imagined. Yuri's body was there, but it was wrong. It was as though his skin had been pulled taut, stretched beyond reason, his limbs twisted and contorted at impossible angles. His eyes were wide open, his mouth stretched in an agonizing scream frozen in the midst of an unholy terror. But worse than the body itself was the emptiness around it. The snow beneath him had been disturbed, torn away, as if something had been pulled from the ground itself. They huddled together, the horror of the scene turning their stomachs, but none of them could bring themselves to look away. None of them dared speak, and still, none of them could explain the absence of footprints. Yuri had not been dragged, he had simply appeared. And then they heard it. The softness of whispers, a voice that wasn't their own. A murmur on the wind, a syllable here, a word there. They couldn't make it out, but it didn't matter. They knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet in the moment they stood there, staring at Yuri's twisted body, each of them felt a creeping certainty. They were not alone. That night, the storm reached its apex. The wind screamed so loud and fierce it threatened to tear the world apart. The tents, once secure, flapped and shrieked under the strain, the fabric trembling though it no longer could hold the weight of whatever presence lurked beyond them. Inside, the air grew heavy with something unseen. The hours stretched on in silence, save for the occasional rustling of fabric and muffled cough of one of the others. But each time they shifted, their eyes lingered on the doorway, where the storm outside seemed to press against them like a living thing. Tasha, who had been the first to speak of the strange sounds, was the first to notice something truly wrong. She had fallen asleep at last, curled up in her bag, but when she awoke, she found herself staring not at the flap of the tent, but at the floor, at the rippling, uneven surface beneath her. The snow was moving. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for the flashlight beside her, but before she could lift it, the noise began again, a scraping, slow and deliberate, like the sound of claws on ice. And then the unmistakable voice, the same voice they could hear in the wind, this time clearer.
"Leave,"
it whispered. Tasha turned to the others, her eyes wide with terror. But when she spoke, her voice came out in a hoarse rasp. "It's here," she said. "It's in the storm." None of them moved. The storm had become their only world, and the silence in the tent grew deeper still. There were no more words, no more frantic pleas for escape, only the quiet of the mountain, the quiet of the snow, and the quiet of the thing that waited just outside the flap. In the end, there was nothing left to do but wait, and they did, until the storm claimed them one by one. When the search parties arrived, they found only the remnants of the camp, the torn tents, the abandoned gear, and the deep, untouched snow that stretched for miles. And for all their searching, they found no bodies. Only the mountain, still, cold, and silent, as if it had never even known their names. Would you still seek answers if the truth meant losing everything? Have you ever heard of a near-death experience? If so, tell us your story by sending us an email at somethingscary@snarled.com.
Sometimes the search for a cure can lead you to something far worse than the affliction itself. Like in this story inspired by Katana.
For as long as I can remember, I hated my deformity. My mother's side of the family was cursed with some kind of flaw. My mother had a misshapen foot, the size of a rugby ball. My grandmother had an eye that bulged out of its socket, almost as if it was going to pop right out. And me? I had a left hand twice the size of a normal one. It was a strange reddish-blue color and looked grotesque. I couldn't escape the way people looked at it, the way they looked at me. My mother said it was all in my head, but I didn't think so. There were some bullies in school who hated me. They'd always pretended to puke when they passed me, or stared at my hand with disgust, as if it was something unnatural. The nicknames were the worst: unborn freak, refined ugliness, deformed witch, and my personal favorite, mutated creep. One boy even made a joke about me being the only girl who had to dry her hands with a bedsheet. Each day it got worse. I could hear the whispers, feel the eyes on me, and after a while I started to hate myself. The school made it worse, and when I switched to homeschooling, it didn't help. Queenstown was small, and everyone knew me. There was no escape. I asked my mom one day why her side of the family was so twisted, and why my dad's side didn't have any deformities. She told me the story of Salvatore Arch, my ancestor. He was born horribly deformed, hunchback, spindly arms and legs, skin binding his fingers together like webbing, his face so distorted that no one could look at him without flinching. The way she described him sent chills down my spine. But the worst part? Salvatore had cursed the bloodline. He'd made sure that every generation after him would carry something wrong, something twisted. My mom said she wasn't any happier than me about it, but nothing could be done. Plastic surgery had been tried, she said, but every attempt ended in disaster or death. She tried to cheer me up by saying I'd find the people worthy of me, just like she had friends and my dad fell in love with her. I brushed it off. I wanted to know more about Salvatore. She continued, telling me about Salvatore's final days. He isolated himself after the birth of his first child, disappearing into the wilderness. They never found his body, but it was said that anyone who ventured into his hideaway came back with no memory of who they were. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was madness. But whatever it was, no one ever went there again. Days passed and the bullying didn't stop. It only got worse. The minutes stretched into years, and the crushing weight of it all began to make me feel like I was suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I started to think that maybe I could escape, like my ancestor. Maybe if I found Salvatore's isolation spot, I could find something, anything that would make this deformity go away. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I spent hours on the internet, digging through old books, searching for any clue about where Salvatore had last been seen. Finally, I found it. An old, dilapidated mine entrance, hidden away beyond an ancient windmill and a reservoir. It was a long way, but I had no other choice. I knew this was my only chance. When I reached the mine, my heart raced. The entrance looked like something out of a nightmare. A crooked square framed by two broken beams, the supports twisted like jagged teeth. I hesitated, but then I entered. The darkness swallowed me whole. Inside, the tunnel stretched endlessly. My flashlight was the only thing that cut through the inky blackness, but it didn't feel like enough. The air was thick, oppressive. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in around me. Then I heard it, a heavy, labored breath. A gasping noise. Someone or something was nearby. My heart pounded as I crept toward the sound. Up ahead, embedded in the wall, I saw a faint oval of light. I shut off my flashlight, trying to make no sound as I approached. Through the hole in the wall, I saw him. Salvatore. The description my mother had given me was exact. He was hunched, his body twisted with growths and boils. His black leather trench coat was covered in algae and rot. His legs, too, were draped in the same dark, decaying leather. I froze in place, staring at him in disbelief. How could he still be alive? He suddenly turned to me, his bloated, sickly lips dripping green slime as he vomited violently. The coat fell from his body, and I saw the full extent of his deformity. His flesh was a mass of blisters and patches, a nightmarish collection of grotesque growths. He raised his misshapen head and looked me in the eyes.
You?
His voice was wet, strained like something was choking him.
Come here.
I couldn't move. My body froze, but I couldn't disobey. Slowly, I moved toward him, the air around me thick with the smell of rot and decay. He reached out with his malformed hand and placed it on my forehead. The moment his touch made contact, pain surged through my body. It felt like my skin was melting. My bones were scraping and twisting under my flesh. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the grotesque laughter that bubbled up from Salvatore's throat. The pain consumed me, and I blacked out. When I woke, everything felt wrong. I looked down at my hands. My fingers were webbed, and my teeth felt wrong, rotted, sharp, and jagged. I tried to scream, but the sound came out as a gurgle. My back hunched unnaturally, and I felt sickness rise in my throat. Green, slimy bile spilled from my mouth as I realized what had happened. I wasn't just deformed anymore. I was Salvatore. And then it hit me. This wasn't just some curse. Salvatore hadn't just died. He had become something worse. He had transferred his soul into me. He had made me his. I wasn't me anymore. I was just a shell cursed to wander this plane forever, waiting for the next fool to come searching for a cure. I could already feel the pull, the longing for the next victim. They would come, just as I had, and when they did, I would make them wish they had never come looking for me. My name is Salvatore, and whoever comes next will never leave. What would you do if the only way to end your suffering was to face a nightmare worse than your worst fear? How would you go to escape a curse that has haunted your bloodline for generations? Do you know of a family that has a curse? Not all demons stay hidden in the dark. Some will follow you home, like in this story inspired by Azka. Amina sat alone in her small hut, running her hands over her growing belly. Her husband, Hassan, had been gone for days, off at sea like most men in the village, fishing to make a living. Pregnancy had made her feel more alone than ever. With each passing day, the quiet of her isolated home, far from the main village, grew more oppressive. The long days wore on, filled with silence and solitude, and at times, Amina felt trapped, suffocated by isolation. She often went to the temple well to fetch water, even if she didn't need it, just to be out of the house, to feel the cool evening air and break the silence. She found herself missing even the faint hum of distant voices, the laughter of children that reached her on rare occasions. One evening just before sunset, Amina made her way to the well. She was running later than usual, but she wanted one last breath of fresh air before the night fell and loneliness pressed in again. She filled her pot slowly, savoring the brief moment of peace in the open air. Suddenly, a soft, grainy sound caught her ear, like sand slipping down stone. She dismissed it as her imagination, shaking off the old folk tales of demons and spirits that villages shared. Foolhu, Dhigu, Handi, that dreaded the umbilical cord demon, was just a story told to frighten children, she told herself. But then the sound came again, louder this time. She turned her head toward the graveyard beside the temple and froze. There, standing between the graves, was Foolhu, Dhigu, Handi. The demon's skin was pitch black, dark as a moonless night, absorbing every glimmer of light. Two twisted horns jutted from its forehead like those of a goat, and its eyes glowed a deep blood red with no iris, just empty haunting pools of crimson. From its belly button trailed a long, slimy umbilical cord and dragged across the ground as it moved. The demon held a human skull, scooping sand and pouring it over its head in a slow, ritualistic motion. Amina's heart hammered in her chest. She tried to scream, but her voice failed her, trapped in her throat by terror. Desperate, she grabbed her half-filled pot and ran. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and she sprinted toward the fence of the temple, clutching the pot close. Just as she reached the gate, the pot slipped from her hand and crashed onto the ground, shattering with a loud echo and filled the evening air. The demon looked up, its red eyes locked onto her, and it growled, a low, guttural sound that shook her to her core. She turned and ran, feeling its gaze burn into her back as she raced home, every step carrying her further from that monstrous figure. She slammed the door shut, breathless, trembling, and curled into her bed, wrapping herself tightly in a blanket. In her mind, the night stretched on endlessly, the shadows lengthening as she lay alone, far from any comfort. At midnight, a heavy footfall disturbed the silence. It was outside, circling her house. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until a violent bang struck the walls, reverberating through her bones. A deep, thunderous voice called her name.
Amina! Amina! Did you see me today in the graveyard, pouring sand on my head? Did you tell anyone about it?
She was too terrified to respond. Foolhu, Dhigu, Handi banged harder against the walls, demanding again.
Amina! Amina! Did you see me today in the graveyard pouring sand on my head? Did you tell anyone?
Her voice shook as she whispered, "No, I haven't seen you. I didn't tell anyone." The demon laughed, the sound like stones grinding together.
I will return tomorrow,
it growled. She lay awake until dawn, dreading its return. When her husband Hassan finally came home the next morning, she told him everything. He resolved to stay with her that night, sharpening his largest knife and making a plan to rid them of the demon. Amina remembered an old saying her grandmother had told her. The demon's one weakness was its umbilical cord, and only by severing it could the evil be destroyed. They prepared a paste from the hottest chilies to burn the demon if it came close. As midnight struck, the footsteps returned, louder than before. The demon's voice boomed from outside.
Amina! Amina! Did you see me yesterday in the graveyard pouring sand on my head? Did you tell anyone about it?
Amina glanced at Hassan, who nodded for her to speak. "Yes," she called, finding her voice. "I saw you in the graveyard, and I've told everyone on the island about it." The demon let out an enraged scream, circling the house in fury, searching for a way in. Its long umbilical cord slithered through a small hole in the wall, twisting and coiling as it reached toward her. Hassan lunged forward, grabbing the cord and slicing it clean with his knife. Blood sprayed across the room, thick and dark, and Amina quickly smeared the chili paste over the severed end. The demon screamed, its voice echoing through the night as it fled. The next morning, they found the demon's body outside, lifeless. The villagers gathered, thanking Amina and Hassan for freeing them from Foolhu, Dhigu, Handi. They buried the demon in an isolated part of the island, warning that anyone who ventured too close would still feel its spirit's rage. What would you do if you couldn't escape this urban legend? Have you ever felt isolated but not alone? Have you sensed something paranormal was near? As always, thanks for being here, witches. Until next time, sweet screams.
This week's podcast stories were edited by Sara Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.